Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our bi-weekly town hall. Today's November 22nd. And again, I'd like to remind you of our co-sponsors, the Lupus Foundation of America, Georgia chapter with Terry and the rest of the crew. We thank you for all that you do each and every day. And then the Georgia Council for Lupus Education and Awareness, and Emory University Division of Rheumatology and the GOAL Project. To remind you that this information is not to be meant to guide people specifically on an individual basis, but that you should take this as general knowledge to then discuss with your particular situation and your healthcare team. So we're marching upward and onward with cases. You're hearing about so much in terms of numbers, and these numbers can get numbing in a way. It's really hard to wrap your hands around these large figures, but here we have it. We have over 57 million people worldwide that have had confirmed infections, with over 1.3 million deaths. And you see the United States continues to lead in the categories of active infections and deaths. And then India, Brazil, France, and the other countries that you see below. Looking at the hotspots throughout the world, you see that the United States is a deeper and darker color of red. And we'll touch upon that in a minute, but you also see a lot of red in the Northern Hemisphere, and especially in Europe, and we'll talk about them in a second, but also into Russia, Iran, northern parts of Africa. And then South America continues to smolder fairly rapidly. But on the other hand, you see most of Africa doing relatively okay, and especially in Asia and Australia, they're doing relatively very well. Touching on Europe, when you look at the confirmed cases in the European Union in the pink here, compared to the United States in the blue, you see that everybody or both parties went up pretty quickly in the beginning, and then Europe got much faster control of it than the United States, which really never did get control fully, stayed sort of plateaued and hit kind of a second peak, whereas Europe went down, and they were feeling too comfortable, in fact. So their cases started to go up, and they rapidly went up, surpassing the United States, leading to severe or relatively severe lockdowns in many countries. And they're starting to bear the benefits of that, because you see over here at the end that their curve is going down. And it has gone to the point where it's equivalent to the US, and it's certainly trending towards being lower than the US, whereas the US, the trajectory continues to go up. And we touched upon this briefly in the past, but the way Europe has gone about it is a variety of lockdowns in various countries, and it can take different patterns, but the common features in general have been that bars, cafes, and restaurants have been closed except for takeout. Gyms and theaters and other non-essential businesses have been closed. They limit the size of social contacts, with large events being closed. And they prohibit the alcohol sales in the evenings. Many of the countries impose curfews. But on the flip side, they did this time around prioritize keeping schools open. So they really focused on the community spread to then allow schools and places of worship to be prioritized in the sense of remaining open or relatively open. And that really is the way to do it, is if you can control or relatively control the community spread, then and facilities like the school should benefit from that. And then they would have a lot of flexibility to some extent by tiering and having regional variation as to the degree of lockdowns, depending on what's going on in particular smaller areas. Now, this is Europe kind of blown up a bit more, and you can see a lot of the red there. And there's one country here that really was not imposing strict lockdowns in up until recently. And I don't know if you can pick that country, but it's the one up here. It's Sweden. And we talked about Sweden early in the pandemic, where they took a whole different route compared to the rest of Europe. And they basically allowed people to get infected. And they kind of went to the road of trying to achieve herd immunity to a certain extent. However, this time around, they're not doing that. And that's because they've really had an unprecedented increase in the number of cases, where they've had more than a doubling of cases in the past 2 weeks. And so they've rapidly increased in a very short period of time, to the point where uh, the the effects on the people and the lives lost and the impact on that end outweighed any potential benefits of just allowing this virus to continue to spread throughout the community without those checks. Now, in the US, we've had a similar rise in cases, and you can kind of get a sense of the colors from earlier this month. And at this point, you could definitely see that the shift of of a large number of cases went from the Southeast, which is still smoldering, but it moved to the Midwest and the upper Midwest. And then you can see here recently that it's just really floridly out of control in parts of the Midwest and the upper Midwest. And this is a clear picture of that. And it's to the point where the number of cases in some of these areas are so frequent that the positive case rate has been nearing 50+%. So more than half of the cases that are being tested in terms of COVID have been coming back positive. So it really is a huge issue, to the likes where no other part of this country, and by the way, no other country in the world has had as high of have a rate that's being seen now, especially in the Dakotas and around those areas. It's so high to the point where it really is at the level of infection that you would need to get herd immunity. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to be a good thing for them in the long run, because they're in a world of hurt, and you can see the impact on the community and the hospitals and the death rates, and so that really is a lesson that this whole discussion of trying to go at this by the way of herd immunity, it would be an absolute nightmare. And the way we should achieve herd immunity is through immunization, which we'll talk briefly about in a little bit. So here are the number of cases in the United States over time. And this recent spike that we're currently in, just look at how much higher it is than anything else that we've experienced. And as you can expect, similarly, the rise in the deaths are going up. It's not as high as what we experienced in the very beginning, but it's starting to achieve that range. It certainly is higher than the previous peak over the summer. And we have every reason to expect that it's going to continue to go up. And a lot of people fear that it's going to be at least, if not greater, than the peak of the deaths that we saw early in the pandemic. Now, the going back to coming to Georgia, you can see that. Well, the first impression is that there's no part of the state that is spared, but the other impression is that the dark red colors uh, do not dominate this map compared to that of the United States. You see a little bit in the northwest corner here, but the rest of the state, even though it still is full of yellow and orange and lighter red, it's not to the point where it seems, the impression is that it's floridly out of control. And that's relatively true. Georgia is not yet being hit as hard as most of the US with this third surge. On the left here is the United States, what I just showed you in terms of the cases rapidly going up. And then here's Georgia, where uh, we're at the point where we certainly see an increase in the number of cases, but we're not as high as the highest peak that we had in the summertime. So we have been relatively spared, but I guess the point is that our cases are continuing to go up. And remember the why we study history, because it could repeat itself to a certain degree. And that's certainly been the case for COVID. And just ask Europe what we should be doing. And we should be using this time to continue to solidify our efforts and our education and our approach so that we can avoid being in those situations. And so this is Georgia as well, from different parameters. I showed you the number of cases that are continuing to go up. The number of deaths are sort of peaking up and down, and you do not get an impression yet that the deaths are rapidly increasing. But if the new cases continue to go up, as we're seeing here on the left, the deaths will continue to rise, most likely. The positivity, I'm sorry, the number of specimens being tested, or the testing that we're doing, has gone up, which is good. We want to make sure that that's available. And I think this is probably being driven a lot by, in part by the coming holidays and people becoming more aware of the need for testing as they plan ahead. And I'll talk to you about the positivity rate in a minute, in the next slide. And here we see hospitalizations that it went dangerously high to the point where we're about to overcome the hospitals in the summertime, but we quickly went down, which is great. And now we're starting to see a rise, but we're not to the point where we're overwhelming the system yet. So all this is relatively good news for us in Georgia, and it certainly is a time to be thankful about that in this period of the holidays. But again, it's certainly not a time to be complacent. Now, the other way of looking at it, though, is that when you add everything up, we are now in the red category, so to speak. And if you go to the COVID Act Now website, based on the culmination of these various parameters, we are deemed to be in the highest risk category, or the red category. So, that should put some other perspective on where we are and continue to underscore the caution that we need to have. Our daily new cases are dangerously high. The infection rate is not as high as in other parts of the country, and I think that in general is part of the picture why we're doing relatively well. But this number continues to rise. It's not red yet, but it is orange. And so everything is pointing towards a wrong direction, if you will. But currently, we're doing relatively okay in terms of infection rate compared to the rest of the country. But again, it's all relative, right? Most of the country is doing very poorly. The test positivity rate, even though more people are getting testing done, we remain under 10%, which is good. We'd like to be closer to 5%, and this continues to go up as well. So again, we need to be cautious. The ICU capacity is still there, but you see the red color in terms of being cautious because we are getting a lot more numbers in terms of the sickest patients with COVID requiring beds in the ICU. And that is really stressing the system, or starting to stress the system. We're not at the point of being overwhelmed like in some other parts of the country, but all of this on the left here will drive the numbers eventually to the ICU, and we certainly don't want that. One slide I didn't put in here was the recent CDC recommendation that some of you might have heard of, that they're generally recommending that we not celebrate Thanksgiving with people outside of our household. And that's because everything is pointing to the fact that most of the transmission is through smaller exposures where people go into other people's homes. And this holiday season is going to be a dangerous time. And it's a time that we want to celebrate. We're having fatigue from the many months before. We're going into the winter doldrums. We want a time to celebrate, but it's just coming at the worst time. And with the hope of so many things happening after this winter, if we can just get through this winter together, we're going to be much better off. One thing that also to think about as we go into the winter is the ongoing use of masks. And you may remember earlier on in the pandemic, the guidance about the mask was with respect to protecting others, that we wore masks so that if we were asymptomatic or symptomatic for that matter, we're reducing the chance of infecting others, and that remains true. But the additional information that's come out that has become much more solid to the point that the CDC has come out with a statement along these lines is that not only do masks help other people, they help yourself. They protect you from being infected from others. And the data is really supporting the use of multi-layer cloth masks. We're not talking these bandanas, these things that people kind of lift up from their necks, the garter, whatever you call those. Those that are really single layers of cloth, they're very poor. But a lot of these commercially available masks, and again, people can make your own masks with at least 2 or 3 layers of cloth worn and fitted correctly around the face, which includes the mouth and the nose, are very protective. And there have been multiple studies that I won't get to here that, and this is just a short list, that really indicate how well these masks can work. Now, I think if you are in a situation where there's a higher risk for exposure, I'll talk about that guidance in a minute. I think there's one question regarding that, but let me circle back to that. But I think in general, for the vast majority of us who are going around doing daily chores, having to go out to go to groceries, get your prescriptions, do errands that you need to do, rest assured that if you are using multi-layered cloth masks that are fitted properly, you are benefiting greatly from that yourself, in addition to helping protect others. Now, the big news recently has been in terms of the COVID vaccines, which has been such an exciting news, to the point where the early results that are coming from these 2 vaccines that have finished their phase 3 studies, that the response rates have been tremendously high. And Pfizer/BioNTech's vaccine has been submitted for emergency use authorization, I think on Friday. So it may take a couple weeks or so, but pretty soon they may get that official authorization. And from what I hear, within that week, they have the vaccines already made and they can start shipping them out and having them done. And so you can see here, the status is that both of them have finished phase 3. Pfizer is submitted for the emergency use authorization. I think Moderna is preparing to go along that road. The Pfizer vaccine, which is the first one out, has an extra logistical issue in that it needs to be stored in extremely cold temperatures. They cannot be in standard freezers. They have to go into these special freezers that go extremely cold, minus 70 degrees Celsius. So even though that is something that is being planned in the rollout, it's going to limit the degree to which the pace at which we can get this out, because not everybody has these freezers, and we need to make more and distribute them. Both of the vaccines here are given in two doses, and you can see the number of people that enrolled in this phase 3 studies to get to the point where they have the data to show that both were about 95% effective. And everybody was so pleasantly shocked by this very high percentage of efficacy. And I think a lot of people were just trying to prepare themselves and hope for something around 60% or so. And to have these numbers is excellent. And Pfizer recently said that they have data to show that in the elderly that it was equally effective. Now, the elderly's immune systems are obviously older, just like they're physically older. But the immune system, when it gets older, can be less responsive or responsive in different ways. And so there was a concern that maybe the vaccine would be even less effective in the elderly, but at least the Pfizer vaccine, and I thought I had read that the Moderna vaccine also had a very high efficacy rate in the elderly. But I mean, this is just great news all around. If the early numbers in terms of who got COVID in these studies, in the Mrna Vaccine study, there were 90 people in the placebo, meaning they did not get the real vaccine, got COVID, and only 5 in the vaccine group, whereas 162 in the Pfizer study in the placebo group got COVID, and only 8. So 160 versus 8, 90 versus 5 got COVID. So it's just tremendous. And also, in terms of those who got COVID and got really severe COVID, where they had to be hospitalized and even ventilated, in the Mrna Vaccine study, all of the really severe COVID cases were in the placebo group, and only one, and all but one were in the placebo group for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. So not only are they effective, they're effective in protecting against severe disease. And there really was no strong signal of a bad side effect or severe side effect in either one of these candidates. At least that's what's being reported initially. And like any vaccine, there's going to be some degree of lower degrees of side effects. And some of these that are listed here are going to be on the list for every vaccine. And given that this is a 2-dose vaccine, it's very common for the second dose to have a slightly greater number of some of these side effects. And that's what's been seen apparently in these vaccines as well. And a lot of local injection site soreness. And again, that's somewhat to be expected, but not extreme or to the point that people had to come out of this study. So the doses that they expect to have in the Mrna vaccine are about 20 million available by the end of this year versus 50 million in the Pfizer vaccine. And then next year, they'll have combined about 2 billion doses available if everything goes well. I'm going to go into vaccines in greater detail, and I'll spread it across 2 or 3 weeks in probably, I'm guessing maybe in a couple months or so. Once some of the vaccines have been distributed, and by then we should have the actual papers and some of the more detailed scientific data from these vaccine studies. Right now, the information on this slide is not from peer-reviewed studies that are published, so we can't really dig into the details too much yet. And also by then, I think we'll have some more experience with these vaccines, so that, I think right now it would be so much guessing, and that I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes at this point, but only just give you the high level information that we know is solid, and that's pretty much what's on this slide. And I know there's plenty of questions about the vaccines, including the ones on this next slide here that have come in this week. And so I'll touch on these, but in a high level, but just know that I do plan to have, as I said before, a more in-depth series on the vaccine process, the type of vaccines, and what it means or potentially could mean for people with lupus. But I'll try to answer these questions as best I can. So the first question here is regarding this COVID vaccine, which is an mRNA vaccine. Is it equivalent to some of the vaccines that we have now? And let me just briefly talk to you about an mRNA vaccine. And again, I'll go over this again in the future. This is really a whole new type of vaccine that hasn't been used at this level and produced for an infectious disease prior to COVID. We've known about this technology. It's been looked at more in the cancer world, but like I said, it's new. No one's gotten an mRNA vaccine routinely up until hopefully this COVID vaccine. And so what the vaccines have been doing up until this point is, what vaccines in general do is they prepare your body to fight the real infection. And all the vaccines that are currently being produced and given expose your body to the virus, like the flu, in either pieces of the dead virus where you cannot get infected by it, but it's actually pieces of the virus that are being given to you, so that your body recognizes those parts, is able to remember it and build an immune response, so that when a real virus does come into contact with the body, it's ready and prepared to mount a very vigorous antibody response against the virus. Or you could have a very mild and weakened form of the virus. So a live virus vaccine that we generally, even though it is weakened, we generally want people that are immunosuppressed, including people with lupus, to stay away from these vaccines, because they do contain some component of live virus, and we just don't fully know what that may do in immunosuppressed people. And we don't want to take that risk, especially if there's other types of vaccines available. So the immune system has been taught to fight the virus either by giving parts of the dead virus or a weakened live virus. But what an mRNA vaccine does is that everybody knows about DNA, right? Not everybody may know about RNA, but they're related. And DNA is the blueprint of everything in your body. the mRNA comes from the DNA. The information from the DNA goes to the mRNA, and that is the blueprint that is the step right before the production of proteins, before what the body makes. So the mRNA really is the blueprint from the blueprint. It's from the DNA. It helps the cells to create certain things. So I mean, it's really ingenious, but they're able to make vaccines where they can insert mRNA into our cells that will allow our own cells to produce little bits of the virus. Not live virus. We're not infecting ourselves, but the body is making little bits of virus so that it can then recognize it and then mount a response to that. So instead of being given little bits of virus externally through a vaccine, we're actually being given the code for that virus through this vaccine, so the body can make little bits of it ourselves and teach ourselves how to fight off the virus if we were to get infected. So if the question is this COVID mRNA vaccine as good as the traditional vaccines? I think the early results that I just show that it's as good, and it seems like much better than the current vaccines in general, because the current flu shot, for example, does not have a 95% efficacy. It's less than that. I don't know the exact number, and I don't want to tell you incorrectly, but this 95% efficacy is excellent. Now, the second question here is it's related to, well, that, we're learning about this vaccine in the general population, and what about in the autoimmune population? What is it going to do to that? And really, and it goes to the last question here at the bottom, how safe is this going to be for people with lupus? I mean, let's get to the meat of the matter. It's great that it seems to be doing well in the clinical trials that recruited generally quote unquote healthy people. And that's fantastic. What does it mean for people with lupus and other autoimmune conditions? We don't know. And we'll have to see some of the details of the current studies that just finished to see what type of patients specifically were ultimately enrolled. Did they allow some people that had stable immune conditions? I'm sure it's a much smaller number, but is there something that we can learn from them? And when the virus and when the vaccine is available for general distribution, we're going to learn about some people who tried it, that had lupus and other autoimmune conditions, and we'll learn bits and pieces. And so I wish I can give you a greater sense of comfort one way or the other, but we don't have that information at this point. COVID, if anything, has taught us how to move forward without perfect data and a lot of information. And I'm afraid that immunizations in lupus and other autoimmune disease in the COVID era, at least for the time being, is going to be very similar. And this is going to be something that you're going to have to discuss with your healthcare provider and discuss individually. And I'm not going to answer if you should get it or not, because there's a lot of variables, but I will give you some things to think about and look forward to. In general, people with autoimmune conditions actually respond very well to vaccines in general. So we've never dealt with the mRNA vaccine, but vaccines, regardless of how they're made, induce immune responses. And I think that we should have some comfort in knowing that at least all the experience up until this point does not point to us saying, no, people with autoimmune issues or who are immunosuppressed should not get this. There's a high chance you're going to have a lot of responses and flares. So we certainly don't have that kind of background, but we need to be cautious because we're dealing with some uncharted waters here and a new approach to a vaccine. And maybe there is a subgroup of people with lupus that are at higher risk of having some flares or issues. What I will tell you also is that there is now more talk and early stages of some actions along these lines in people with lupus. So obviously the initial effort needs to be focused on the general population. Is this generally accepted and effective and safe for people? And we're starting to transition from that point to getting that out into the public. And so we're able to know what we're dealing with. We have a couple vaccines. We know how they're made and designed. And so people are really starting to talk in the world of lupus about these questions. And the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, are talking to high-level researchers, including those at our institution, about how to design and address some of these questions, and design a study to address some of these questions. So I'm very confident in saying that we will have lupus-specific studies with COVID vaccine. I don't know how soon we'll have those definitive answers. It will not be, those answers will not be here in time when the first vaccines are available for the general public. So probably most of us will still not be without strong scientific data to guide our decision-making in the early stages of the vaccine distribution. And that will be a time when many of you will be eligible to get the vaccine. So we'll just have, we're getting new information every day, and look how far we've come since the beginning of the pandemic in terms of understanding and being comfortable with how we're dealing with all of this. And we're going to be as fast, if not faster, when it comes to the vaccine. So stay tuned. This is a question regarding, and just like a lot of lupus studies have not had enough minority representation, so you wonder about how the results truly translate to diverse communities. The same question is going to be there for the vaccine trials. And since we don't have the detailed data and the reports and the published study, the peer-reviewed published study from these vaccine studies yet, it's hard to answer this question, but it should be there. I don't know so much about Pfizer, and I'm not saying that Pfizer's study isn't like this, but Moderna's study was done at Emory and specifically at Grady. And I think we were one of the largest recruiters at Grady, if not the largest, but certainly one of the largest recruiters. And obviously we serve a large African-American community, and that was by design. So I know there was a concerted effort to try to recruit minority communities, since they were recognized relatively early on that they were disproportionately hit by COVID. So we'll just have to wait and see what the data shows in terms of those studies, and have to make a decision ourselves as to how generalizable these results are going to be based on who was in that study, including the racial and ethnic distribution. So good question. We just need to learn more. This is the question about that I was referencing earlier about the masks. So I said, generally speaking, the multi-layered cloth masks are good. I think and this is just purely my opinion, so this is a huge asterisk here. There's no solid data, but I think if you pull everything together, um, I think most people would feel fine, like I said, in the general public, doing errands and so forth, even going to see a doctor in their office or in a healthcare environment where you're the patient and you're going to see to an office visit. Multi-layered cloth mask is fine. But if you are in certain industries or professions where you're in much more frequent and closer contact to other individuals, and this could include being a teacher or being in the service industry, as well as obviously being a physician or a healthcare provider. Uh, being a healthcare provider, for sure, there's data to support that we need a higher degree of masking. So, what about these other industries like being a teacher or in the service industry? Uh, Multi-layered cloth masks are certainly better than anything else. And I think if that's all you have, and remember, there's other parts to this equation. There's the physical distancing, there's barriers, and are the other people around you, are they masking very well? It's a whole different story if you're in a room full of kids that aren't masking, running around screaming and singing and spraying saliva everywhere. Um, but if everybody's being masked, which is in a classroom setting, depending on how far they are, how well they're distanced, how controlled the environment is, that may be very well. But if there's other variables that aren't well controlled, then I personally would consider a higher level of masking, and that's to the line of those KN95 masks that I've been mentioning, which are available online. So this question, this study seems to say that the COVID-related deaths were triggered by an exaggerated immune response. And it's reference to this particular study. And, all this to say is that COVID kills not necessarily from the virus itself, but it's our body's reaction to the virus. And so it's that initial infection that then triggers an inflammatory response. And in some people, and this is what we're trying to understand, why some people are asymptomatic, some people are mildly symptomatic, and some people are in the hospital and dying. What's different about them? And part of it could be something about people's different genetics or environments that lead their immune systems to respond differently to the virus. So the infection occurs in all of those groups, but for some reason or reasons, some people's immune response is highly exaggerated, and it becomes dangerously so. There's a huge inflammatory response, and that is what people are dealing with in the ICUs. There's a ton of inflammation in the lungs that is causing the lungs to drown themselves. It's this COVID pneumonia that you're hearing about, and that's what is requiring people to get intubated and have a machine really do the um, work of breathing and with high amounts of oxygen to bypass or get through this layer of fluid that's built up from the inflammation in the lungs. So we've known for a long time that it's this inflammatory response. And this is behind the one drug that has scientific data to show that it decreases mortality in people with COVID in the intensive care unit. And that one drug is dexamethasone, which is basically prednisone. And we're all very familiar with prednisone. We don't want to use prednisone too much, and I don't want you to use prednisone for protecting yourselves against COVID. It's only helpful and been shown to be helpful in that window of time when people have been infected and they have this very strong immune response and are about to or in the ICU. Any other time, in fact, using too much prednisone on a chronic basis may cause some other issues that uh, that we want to avoid. I mean, they cause, steroids in general cause issues we want to avoid if taken long term. But I just bring that up that that the inflammation that we are seeing is well known. Now, the mechanisms, the details of that inflammation, what's involved is what we're starting to learn more about now. And this particular article is talking about the role of these signals between cells that occurs with certain types of inflammation called interferons that may play a role. And just to whet your appetite even more, interferons have a lot to do with a lot of people and their lupus. Interferon is an important cell signal protein that is responsible or seems to be associated with lupus flares in a lot of people with lupus, to the point that there is a drug that blocks interferon called anifrolumab that is being produced or developed by AstraZeneca that had a successful phase 3 study in lupus without kidney involvement. They have a separate study with lupus nephritis that's still ongoing. But in terms of lupus without kidney involvement, it had positive results. And they are planning, or they're in the process of getting this formally approved by the FDA. As to how interferons relate to COVID specifically, it's still a little bit too early, but to discuss that in detail. But all of this is just amazing and exciting information to learn about. Oops. I've been hearing that COVID is spread primarily through respiratory droplets in close person-to-person contact, and that's true. Early in the pandemic, it was recommended to sanitize groceries, prescriptions that could not be set aside for a period of at least 3 days. And this is something that a high-risk patient should be considering and doing now. And I do remember early in the pandemic, there were these YouTube videos about how to sanitize packaging from the grocery store or a takeout from a restaurant. And so I guess what I would say at this point is that the vast majority of cases do get infected through respiratory droplets going from the lungs of an infected individual into the air, breathed in into the nose or mouth, and going into the lungs and upper respiratory system. So it's a direct lung-to-lung kind of infection, if you will, through respiratory droplets. But the virus has been shown to live for a while on surfaces, and it can certainly be transmitted that way through the surfaces, but it's just not as easy and effective. So the risk is still there. So I would say, generally speaking, that you need to be careful with packaging, and assuming people aren't sneezing on the packaging, touching it in great to a large degree. If it's just standard routine management of the packaging, and individuals are masked, and hopefully most restaurants are like this, and workers are like this, then it should be relatively low risk. So I don't think you need to disinfect the packaging or anything like that, or wipe every single surface. But I do continue to recommend hand washing, masking, social distancing. That's part of the formula that we've been talking about from the very beginning, so that it's a very simple step, and we should just get used to this. That reality is always going to be there, that's a potential way of getting sick. And this is very similar to the common cold, right? Most people get the common cold because they're relatively near someone else. I mean, we've been used to these issues forever. We just haven't been so focused like we are as we have been with COVID. With the common cold, the vast majority of cases are because someone is talking around you, sneezing around you, it's in the air. But there's a smaller but not insignificant percentage of people who get colds because you're touching doorknobs and you're rubbing your eyes from that. So, it's not as easy for the cold virus to get into your body that way, but that definitely is a way, depending on how many surfaces you're touching and how well you're touching your eyes or your nose or your mouth. So why even risk that when you can simply break that cycle by washing your hands before you touch your mouth or anything like that? You wash them regularly, especially after you've touched things from the outside. But no, I don't know anybody who's routinely recommended sort of this really in-depth sanitization or sanitizing of the packaging that's involved. We were, to be honest, a little freaked out about that in the beginning, about whether postal deliveries and things like that, just every little surface can be infected. Assume that it is, but as long as you just wash your hands, you're going to be okay. I'm going to look here in the chat box to see if anybody else has any questions. So the US appears dark red, and the US is number 1, but India is number 2, but it looks only orange and yellow. Yes, because they're different lists. The first list that I showed with the US being number 1, India being number 2, is the total number of cases to date. So that's over many months, with peaks and valleys of new cases during that time. But that map with the heat map that I was showing you, the US is much darker red because currently the rate of new cases is much higher in the US than it is in India. So that's the difference. Yeah, in Poland and other countries, Australia, I remember at one point they had police force and fines, literally fines in the thousands of dollars to individuals who are not following some of these lockdown and other enforcement rules. It's not going to fly in the US, culturally or possibly legally to some extent, but it certainly was effective. So can the vaccine be used as a therapeutic? No, it wouldn't make sense, because if someone's already infected and needs a therapy for COVID, the vaccine is not going to add any more to that. Your body has already been being exposed to the virus. You're starting to develop antibodies. So what I was showing from the vaccine data is that it protected people in general, and it protected them so well that even the most severe cases of COVID were avoided. But that does not mean that the vaccines can be used to treat the most severe cases of active COVID infection. Okay, so this is, I hope you got something out of this. I'm sorry to go a little bit longer this time. As always, I want to thank Terry and the Lupus Foundation of America, Georgia chapter. Please continue to check their website, get on their listserv, go to the COVID resources that they have. Please continue to send questions every couple weeks, or any other suggestions that you have for us. And please be safe during this time of Thanksgiving and into the rest of the holidays. We have a lot to be thankful for, and there's a lot of hope coming our way. and we just need to get through a couple more months. And I am so excited about. Uh, there's so much hope, and these vaccines and new treatments, and what we're learning about the virus is there's just so many positive things going on that if we can just get through this winter, um, it will be a new world, so to speak. I don't think things will ever be back to normal, but it'll be much more normal than we've had in a long time. And um, yes, I'm just really excited about that. And we're going to get there together. But let's really support each other, equip each other. We do need that support. It is going to be hard. It's mentally hard for me. Um, but just knowing that there's light at the end of the tunnel should give us all that extra energy and drive, um, to get there. So thanks again, and we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.